Hi, I'm Rosie and this is Mouse, and today I'm going to talk to you about cake, heresy, treason, and William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, written circa 1595, is a play filled with fairies. It features the subjugation and humiliation of more than one female monarch, and it also contains and celebrates magical ritual. And, you might wonder, well, 1595 was a time when fairies were often aligned with the threat of witches, dark magic, and, even worse, Catholic heresy. Queen Elizabeth I was the reigning monarch, and superstition and fear surrounding Catholicism and its conflation with magic and ritual was at an all-time high. This was a tense religious and political climate. Many, if not all, of Shakespeare's contemporaries fell foul of the censors at one time or another and had their plays cut or banned, some of them getting into serious and life-threatening trouble for their work. As James Shapiro writes, of all the major playwrights of the 1590s, Shakespeare alone had managed to avoid a major confrontation with those in power. So the big question I'm interested in is, how did Shakespeare include these kinds of controversial themes in his work, themes that could have landed him in big trouble with the mighty institutions of church and monarchy, without getting into trouble? The answer to Shakespeare's success, much like the success of this delicious Elizabethan rose cake, lies in the careful crafting of multiple layers. If this cake contains layers of soft, airy sponge concealing delicious raspberry and rose jam, Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream contains multiple layers of exquisitely crafted narrative, designed in part to obscure any clear allegiance to a political or religious principle. Now, by the way, this cake is my version of Wolfe's Rose by Any Other Name cake, or Will Shakespeare's Birthday Cake by Anne Louise Avery. So our version turned out all right. We're not the most proficient bakers and we made some ill-judged substitutions. It tastes good, but it looks kind of like something from Nailed It. If you want to see how amazing this cake should have looked, and if you want to try making it yourself, please subscribe to Anne Louise Avery's Patreon, where you'll also find lots of other recipes and beautiful stories. So anyway, Shakespeare has layers of narrative, I have layers of cake. Now, crucially, I would argue, Shakespeare explores the use of doubt and uncertainty as creative principles that allow him to explore all possible perspectives without adopting any single one. And this principle is perfectly encapsulated by John Keats in his most famous epistolary nugget of wisdom, negative capability. Now, I touch on negative capability in my video on Keats, but it's worth quoting here again to illustrate this point. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So firstly, what does Keats mean here? Let's have a look at a few key parts of the quote. When Keats uses the word negative, it's important to know he isn't using it pejoratively, i.e. he doesn't mean negative as in bad. He's using it to indicate absence, to suggest that a person's identity, their intellectual or creative capability can be defined by what they don't know, as well as, or rather than, what they do. A man of achievement, like Shakespeare, doesn't strive to pin down every fact, doesn't qualify his brilliance by knowing everything. His genius comes from accepting that some things cannot be known or understood, and that in itself offers a different kind of wisdom and understanding. Doubt and uncertainty are a valuable, if not essential, part of the creative process. And it's this doubt and uncertainty that Shakespeare uses incomparably when writing about dicey, potentially life-threatening themes. As I'll go on to demonstrate, his writing is so clever because it offers up multiple perspectives without championing a single one, without confirming a definite belief, something Keats emanates and develops readily in his letters. Shakespeare scholars have for centuries tried to pin down his beliefs, often dissecting his plays or sonnets to find evidence or making claims based on the very few facts we have of his personal life. But this is all conjecture. We don't even have definitive proof that his appearance as we know it is an accurate representation. Bill Bryson explains that we have three likenesses from which all others are derived: this one, and this one. Two that aren't very good by artists working after his death, and one that's rather more compelling as a portrait, but that may well be of someone else altogether. The paradoxical consequence is that we all recognise a likeness of Shakespeare the instant we see one, and yet we don't really know what he looked like. It's like this with nearly every aspect of his life and character. He is at once the best known and least known of figures. In sum, we can't accurately pinpoint what Shakespeare believed, no matter how much we might want to. Just as this cake captures a myriad of complex flavours, Shakespeare's work brilliantly captures a myriad of complex ideas and beliefs. You could scour A Midsummer Night's Dream and find lots of quotes in support of your argument that Shakespeare was writing an anti-monarchy play. You could also find the same amount of quotes that prove he was pro-monarchy. And it's that complexity, those layers, intricately woven, that means his work is enduringly fascinating, and that helped him to keep his head on his shoulders. But why did he have to grapple with censors, religious controversy, and the fear of demonic fairies at all? Why did he have to be careful when writing about dreams, shadows, monarchy, and midsummer magic? To answer those questions, and to provide examples of how Shakespeare sidesteps the problems of censorship his contemporaries often did not, we need first to embark on a brief history lesson and learn something about the Elizabethan age and the widespread fear posed by Catholicism, superstition, and treason. To begin with, happy Midsummer's Day! It's the 24th of June, and according to the Christian Church, this is the designated date for midsummer celebrations. Those celebrations do also take place on the evening of yesterday, the 23rd. Now, the 24th isn't always the literal longest day of the year. The date of the summer solstice varies, but it's always pretty close. Midsummer traditions long predate Christianity and, of course, Shakespeare, who lived between 1582 and 1616, and specific traditions and religious associations vary between countries and places. Now, if you lived in England a few generations before Shakespeare, let's say in the year 1500, you may well celebrate Midsummer as part of your Catholic devotion. England was Catholic at this time, and the Church recognised the 24th of June as the feast day of St John the Baptist. Festivities might include drinking, dancing and merrymaking, and the lighting of bonfires to ward off evil spirits. Living in England at this time, you would likely be aware that your midsummer celebrations are closely aligned with the supernatural, with fairies, ghosts, luck, magic and superstition all featuring in ritual practice, and that these traditions are much beloved and celebrated by people up and down the country. However, fast forward a few generations and you would witness these traditions undergoing significant disruption, to the extent that by the time Shakespeare was living and writing, they would be turning into something of a distant memory. Why? Well, this has to do with the seismic religious and political upheaval that occurred as a result of Henry VIII and his split with Rome in 1534. Now, we're all familiar with tyrannical Henry and his treatment of his wives, a fascinating section of royal history often distilled into the schoolhouse rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So let's have a look at Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, aka divorced. Now, divorced in the 1500s was not really a thing, certainly not in the way we think of it today. To break up a sacred bond made before God was not something that you could obtain lightly, if at all. But Henry wanted that divorce. He was in love, or more likely in lust, with Anne Boleyn, aka beheaded, and he desperately wanted a son and heir. So far, his only legitimate heir was Mary, who was the daughter of Catherine. Anne, unlike many other women, refused to become just another mistress. She wanted to be queen, so Henry tried his best to divorce Catherine and appealed to the Pope, who rejected his request. The only way he could effectively divorce Catherine was by taking matters into his own hands. Henry broke with Rome and the authority of the Pope and, in 1534, passed his Act of Supremacy and declared himself head of the Church of England. He was now free to divorce his loyal wife of over 20 years and to marry Anne. And this gave way to the cataclysmic religious and political period known as the English Reformation. Now, I don't want to suggest that pre-Reformation England was all tickety-boo, happy Catholic without a care in the world. It's not like Henry VIII invented Protestantism and the country changed overnight. There was a wider Protestant Reformation happening over Europe. Nor did Henry himself make a sudden and complete turn in his personal religious practice from Catholic to Protestant. Eamon Duffy tells us that Henry, for all his cynicism and hatred of the papacy, that's the authority of the Pope, remained attached to much of the traditional framework of Catholicism. But what I do want to highlight is that the English Reformation played a key role in disrupting religious order. It worked as a catalyst for change that would lead to decades of unrest in England and across Europe, and that would come to characterise Shakespeare's age and give shape to his writing. Now, if you don't know much about the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, you might wonder, why was there such a fuss? These are all effectively branches of the same religion, right? Why is there such a big divide? Well, there were and are significant theoretical and practical differences between the two facets of Christianity that it's important to touch on here. So the Catholic medieval church, as Keith Thomas writes, acted as a repository of supernatural power which could be dispensed to the faithful to help them in their daily problems. Congregants worshipped at Mass, prayed to saints, and communicated to God through priests. Places and things were consecrated to ward off evil. Church bells, for example, were consecrated so when a storm broke out, they could be tolled to chase away the evil spirits thought to be causing the thunder and lightning. So, as Thomas summarises, the medieval church thus appeared as a vast reservoir of magical power. Any prayer or piece of the scriptures might have a mystical power waiting to be tapped. What was religion and what was magic was difficult to clearly discern, and this was a key complaint in the Protestant agenda against Catholicism. Protestantism generally sought to do away with the frivolities of Catholic ritual. Saints, shrines, relics and superstitions were cast aside. The use of consecrated bells in thunderstorms, for example, were considered mere witchcrafts. Protestants also sought to make religion more accessible. Rather than using the priest and the church as middlemen, they encouraged people to communicate directly with God, cutting out the pomp and ritual Catholic practices promoted, and that included celebrations like Midsummer. As Shapiro writes, when England had been Catholic, Midsummer had been a day of festive release, a time to light bonfires and for youths and girls to dance all day with flowers in their hands. For proponents of Protestant reform, however, these frivolities smacked of the worst of papistry and paganism. By mid-century, John Stow lamented the great midsummer celebrations of his youth had all but died out. Now, while it wasn't as black and white as all Protestant reformers sought to end these practices immediately without hesitation, the general consensus was that Protestantism rejected the magical powers and supernatural sanctions which had been so plentifully invoked by the medieval church. So, when Henry broke with Rome, Protestant reformers had an in. They could ramp up their dismantling of what they saw as the Catholic magic of the dark Middle Ages. But this, of course, caused a great deal of unrest. Henry angered the Pope and much of Catholic Europe, enacted the dissolution of the monasteries throughout England in the late 1530s, and caused mass disruption. And he had Anne Boleyn executed not long after marrying her, and she also didn't give him a son, just a daughter, Elizabeth, so it was totally worth it. But lucky for Henry, his next marriage to Jane Seymour, aka Died, brought him the son he so desired. After 3 more marriages to Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, Henry died in 1547, with his succession, his male heir, secured. His son, Edward, who was 9 at the time, came to the throne, and he was super Protestant, but he didn't last long, dying of an unspecified illness that some historians believe to have been tuberculosis or consumption, a disease you can learn more about in my video, only 6 years later, at the age of 15. Having no children, he was first succeeded very, very briefly by his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, whom he named his successor in the hope of keeping England Protestant. But Jane was executed only 9 days later and replaced by Mary, the first English queen to wear the crown in her own right, daughter of Catherine of Aragon and passionate Catholic. She married Philip II of Spain, also a passionate Catholic, and is remembered in part for enacting something of a reign of terror throughout England. As Maylan Solly writes, Mary prioritised religion above all else, implementing reforms and restrictions aimed at restoring the Catholic Church's ascendancy in England. Most controversially, she ordered 280 Protestants burned at the stake as heretics, a fact that would later cement her reputation as Bloody Mary. But she didn't last especially long on the throne either. Only 5 years after her accession, Mary died childless in 1558, aged 42, and her younger sister, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, took to the throne and would rule for 45 years. Under Elizabeth, England was reverted back to Protestantism, so you can see how, in a very short space of time, the official national religion flip-flops dramatically. And you can imagine the effect this has on its people, to whom religion was a fundamental part of life. It was baked into the fabric of daily routine, you might say. As Ian Mortimer writes, what is orthodox in 1558 is sufficient to have you hanged in 1570. The massive religious upheavals at work during the 1500s led to uprisings and revolts, assassination attempts, mass executions and war. So how did all this affect the Catholics living during Elizabeth's reign? Though she held Protestant beliefs, at the start of her reign in 1558, Elizabeth didn't suddenly outlaw Catholicism and rampage around the country murdering heretics. The outlawing of Catholic practices was slow and steady during her reign, spurred on by the numerous assassination attempts made against her. And there was resistance in the government and amongst the general public to the conversion of the country back to Protestantism. As Duffy tells us, Elizabeth's Act of Uniformity, which called for abolishing the Mass and reintroducing a slightly modified version of the second prayer book of Edward VI, passed by the nerve-wracking margin of 3 votes in April 1559 and came into use on the 24th of June, on Midsummer's Day no less. We'll get back to Midsummer shortly. Such a slim margin, and the various compromises Elizabeth had to make to secure her victory, highlights the prevalence of religious division. Duffy argues that in parishes throughout the country, the move towards Protestantism was met with reluctant and partial conformity. But to hold this position, to be outwardly practising as a Catholic, and to only partially conform to these new rules would not be as easy later on in the reign. In the first few years of Elizabeth's rule, the punishment for not attending a Church of England service on a Sunday and on a holy day was a fine of 1 shilling. As Mortimer writes, it is possible to be a Catholic recusant without too much trouble, if you can afford the 12p fine every Sunday, and the English government is still relatively tolerant of religious deviation in the 1560s. Yes, there are searches for seditious and heretical writings, and certain people are placed under house arrest for harbouring Catholic agitators. Suspected Catholics are denied political roles and stripped of their offices, but it is not a treasonable act simply to be a Catholic. However, things were about to change. A few events took place that made it impossible for Elizabeth and her government not to take a harsher stance against Catholicism. As more and more attempts were made against her life with the objective to put a new Catholic monarch on the throne, her leniency waned. After the Northern Rebellion in 1569 and the subsequent excommunication of Elizabeth by the Pope in early 1570, things got hairy. The Pope issued a papal bull, a decree that instructed all good Catholics to turn against their monarch. So no longer can the people just sort of put up with things. Catholics are now required by the Pope to denounce Elizabeth, putting them in the position of choosing between faith and state. Things get worse and worse, and the conflict intensifies on both sides. England goes to war with Catholic Spain in 1585. Mary, Queen of Scots, is executed in 1587 for her part in the plot to overthrow Elizabeth and take her place as a new Catholic queen. And the Spanish Armada set sail for England in 1588. By the 1590s, Shakespeare's most prolific period of writing, and during which he wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream, what Mortimer dubs the most extreme anti-Catholic act of all was passed. Those not attending church for a month are imprisoned. Catholics are not allowed to travel more than 5 miles from their homes on pain of forfeiting all their property and estates. They must register with the local authorities and obtain a licence if they wish to go anywhere. So, as far as Protestant reformers were concerned, Catholic recusants were finally getting their just desserts. And this is on top of earlier laws making Mass illegal, making the attempt to convert someone to Catholicism high treason and executable offence, and of course many Catholics were captured, tortured and executed for their beliefs. And where Shakespeare comes into this is that this very anti-Catholic vibe also impacted the world of the theatre. Shapiro argues that the reformist effort to do away with the distracting rituals of Catholic worship resulted in a kind of sensory deprivation, for the rush to reform had overlooked the extent to which people craved the sights and sounds of the old communal celebration. One way of filling the gap left by the absence of Catholic ritual was theatre, another form of communal celebration that allowed spectators to indulge in an exciting sensory experience. And as Shapiro goes on to point out, Protestant reformers who initially thought the theatre could be a great way for them to communicate their own religious message quickly turned against it. So we can see how theatre in general could easily be aligned with Catholic practice and ritual. So, this real, insidious suspicion and dislike of Catholicism was in full swing by the time we get to A Midsummer Night's Dream. But you could certainly make a case that the play itself contains some distinct Catholic themes, maybe even an anti-Elizabeth agenda. In a climate in which it was a crime just to hear Mass being spoken, punishable by a 100-mark fine and a year in prison, how did Shakespeare dare to even dabble in themes that remotely hinted at Catholic ritual? Could the play potentially offend the Censors, a Protestant audience, and even the Queen herself? Let's get stuck in. First, I'll give you a brief summary of the plot to make things clearer. The action begins in Athens, just before the wedding of Duke Theseus and his bride Hippolyta, the Amazon queen Theseus wooed with his sword and is seemingly forcing into marriage. Citizen Aegeus comes to Theseus with a complaint against his daughter, Hermia. Hermia is in love with Lysander, but her father, Aegeus, wants her to marry Demetrius. Both Lysander and Demetrius love Hermia. Hermia is told by Theseus that her options are marry Demetrius, become a nun, or be put to death. Unsatisfied with these options, Hermia and Lysander plan to elope and take to the woods outside Athens by night. They tell their plans to Helena, Hermia's childhood friend, who is herself in love with Demetrius. So Hermia and Lysander leave for the woods, and Helena tells Demetrius about it. Demetrius then goes to the woods after them, followed by Helena. With me so far? On the same night, a group of rude mechanicals, that's working men of Athens, gather in the woods to practice their play, which tells the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, which they hope to perform before the Duke as part of his wedding celebrations. They're led by Peter Quince and dominated by Nick Bottom the Weaver, who gets overly excited and insists on playing all the parts himself. In another part of the woods, Titania and Oberon, Queen and King of the Fairies, meet. They're feuding because Oberon wants Titania's changeling boy, that's the son of her friend who died and whom she is now raising, and she won't give him up. They argue. Titania leaves and in comes Puck, or Robin Goodfellow, Oberon's right-hand fairy. Oberon instructs Puck to find a magical flower which, if administered to a person's eyes, will make them fall in love with the next creature they see. Puck finds the flower, and Oberon administers it to Titania while she sleeps, as a form of revenge and coercion. He also observes a fight between Demetrius and Helena, in which the former tells the latter to leave him alone. Oberon takes pity on Helena and asks Puck to administer some magic flower to Demetrius so he can fall in love with Helena. Then some classic Shakespearean mixed-up identity madness ensues. Puck uses the flower on Lysander by accident, who comes across Helena and falls in love with her. Puck gives Bottom the head of an ass, and all Bottom's fellow players flee in terror. Bottom then stumbles upon Titania's bower. She wakes and sees him and falls in love with him. Puck tries to rectify his mistake with Lysander and gives some magic flower to Demetrius, so then you've got both men in love with Helena, leaving Hermia furious and upset. They all fight and get lost, eventually falling asleep. After they've had their fun, Oberon and Puck remove the magic flower power for everyone but Demetrius. Titania gives in to Oberon and hands over her changeling boy, making everything right once more in Fairyland. Demetrius and Helena couple up, and Lysander and Hermia reunite. Bottom's head is restored to normal. Everyone wakes up and the lovers and mechanicals head to Athens. Theseus allows the new couples to stay together, overruling Aegeus, and Bottom and co perform their terrible play. Titania and Oberon bless the marriage of Theseus and Hippolyta, and Puck gives the epilogue. So, we've got 3 character groupings, the lovers, mechanicals and fairies, 5 acts, and what at least appears on the surface to be a neat resolution where everyone gets what they want. Now, there's a lot of scholarship that highlights the unsettling tone of the play's conclusion, but some of the things that seem remiss for me are the fact that Demetrius is still under a spell. You could argue he doesn't really love Helena, at least not in the same way that Lysander loves Hermia. And my biggest gripe with the whole play is that Titania makes a really moving case for why she is rearing up her friend's son, and Oberon, petty and jealous, mocks her, embarrasses her, and tricks her into giving the boy up. This was beautifully rectified in the 2020 Bridge Theatre production of the play, in which Oberon and Titania swap roles, putting the Fairy Queen in the position of power, which felt really refreshing, and it also meant that Bottom and Oberon fell in love, which was the icing on the cake, and they had a big pride flag on stage, and it was just a really effective decision. For that, and so many other reasons, I still consider it the best theatre I've seen, and you can watch a recording of it via National Theatre at Home. But back to the play as written. Essentially, I would agree with the summation that the play offers a happy resolution like an Elizabethan comedy should, but only so long as you don't look too closely at what some characters have had to give up. It's a comedy, but with some very tragic elements at play. But what's so Catholic about A Midsummer Night's Dream? Is there an anti-monarchy, or specifically an anti-Elizabeth agenda in the text? I'm going to answer those questions in reverse, so let's start with the Queen. Things that are important to bear in mind for our purposes here. Elizabeth was widely known as the Virgin Queen. She never married or had children. She's also very powerful, and she was often referred to and celebrated as the Moon, or a moon goddess. So you might imagine that it must be crucial for any play hoping to survive the censors, and for any playwright hoping to survive full stop, to be very careful only to praise the Queen. Any mention of the moon must be framed in a positive light. But let's have a look at how Shakespeare writes about the moon in A Midsummer Night's Dream. First of all, mention of the moon and of moonlight is abundant in the play. Of course, the action takes place at night, so this makes sense. Sense of time is often meted out by reference to the moon, and significant occasions and meetings take place by moonlight. When looking forward to his wedding, Theseus measures the remaining time with reference to the moon. He says, 4 happy days bring in another moon. When Hermia is set to choose her fate, she must make her decision by the next new moon. Hermia and Lysander explain their plan to elope with reference to the moon, saying that they will leave tomorrow night when Phoebe, that's the moon, doth behold her silvery visage in the watery glass. Peter Quince asks his actors to meet him in the palace wood a mile without the town by moonlight, and the fairy king and queen meet under the moon, their exchange opening with Oberon's famous line, "Ill met by moonlight, proud Titania." And this is only in Act 1 and the very beginning of Act 2. So there's this sense that the moon is observer to each of the 3 groups, the lovers, fairies and mechanicals. This sense of omnipresence could represent Elizabeth's power. Like the moon, she is everywhere, all-knowing. She sees all. The moon is at once clear and elusive, powerful and mysterious. As Sukanta Chaudhary writes, the moon is and is not all things to everyone under its sublunary spell. But you don't have to look far in the text to find representations of the moon that don't evoke a sense of power, authority or true sight, that you could interpret as massive insults. In the very first few lines of the play, the moon is presented as getting in the way. So as I've said, Theseus is counting down the days till his wedding by referring to the moon, but he's getting impatient. But oh, methinks how slow this old moon wanes. She lingers my desires, like to a stepdame or a dowager, long withering out a young man's revenue. So here we can see that Theseus is anxious for the new moon and the night of his nuptials. But if we take the moon to be Elizabeth, there's an added layer to take into account. The moon / Elizabeth is taking too long to wane, i.e. die, and leave the throne vacant. Theseus's wants represent those of the masses. His desires aren't being met with this old woman in power. She doesn't represent possibility and authority anymore. She's comparable to a stepdame or dowager, i.e. an old widow who's inherited her husband's estate, thus preventing a younger male heir from inheriting it. And indeed, there was a very real anxiety and frustration surrounding Elizabeth's rule at this time. Historians often refer to this period as the nasty 90s, during which Elizabeth was particularly unpopular. Now, there had always been people who thought Elizabeth, as a woman, was unfit to rule. As Jennifer Clement explains, as a woman on the throne, the Queen provokes enormous anxiety about female dominance and male inadequacy. And certainly one way of reading the play is that Shakespeare manages this anxiety through the play's effective suppression of queenly power by a final assertion of male authority. So women shouldn't rule, but more than this, there was a particular anxiety surrounding Elizabeth's refusal to marry her virgin status. Clement writes that 16th century Protestants tended to regard virginity with suspicion. There's something unnatural about it. It's the antithesis of a woman's traditional role to bear children. On top of that, there's the added problem of Elizabeth's succession. In 1595, she's in her 60s, which is a ripe old age for a person living during this period. And not only is she childless, but she refuses to name an heir. Without an heir, the stability of the throne and the country's religious future is uncertain. So you can really draw parallels between this old moon taking forever to wane and Elizabeth sitting on the throne for so long, keeping her people in a state of anxiety. Then, only a few pages later, Theseus offers a different kind of moon-related insult. When he's giving Hermia her choices, marry Demetrius, become a nun, or death, he urges her to consider the sad reality of living as a nun. For I to be in shady cloister mewed, to live a barren sister all your life, chanting faint hymns to the cold, fruitless moon. Thrice blessed they that master so their blood to undergo such maiden pilgrimage, but earthlier happy is the rose distilled than that which, withering on the virgin thorn, grows, lives, and dies in single blessedness. So we've got this image of the cold, fruitless moon. If we apply these adjectives to the Queen, we might infer that she is distant and aloof, rather than present and commanding. She's also fruitless, i.e. childless. Hermia, Theseus argues, would be happier in life as a wife and mother, a rose distilled, than as a nun, virgin, barren, withering, words which really seem to hammer home Elizabeth's childlessness and age. So we've got two examples then from very early on in the text that draw on the acute political anxieties of the time of Elizabeth and her unmarried status. You could certainly make the case that A Midsummer Night's Dream champions the subordination of women and the benefits of male rule. Think of the other two queens in the play, Titania, who refuses her husband's will in favour of her female friend and gets her comeuppance, and Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons, who is effectively married to Theseus against her will. Queens, in this play, have to be ruled by kings. But there are two important things to bear in mind here, especially when it comes to asking questions like, how did Shakespeare get away with this? Wasn't the Queen hugely insulted by this slight against her divine rule? Firstly, we need to remember that this was a significantly more patriarchal society than ours is today. Looking back at a play like this from our perspective, it might be difficult not to view a lot of the action as misogynistic. But in 1595, it was generally accepted that women were inferior to men, even by Elizabeth herself. In her famous Tilbury speech, delivered to her troops as they braced to face the Spanish Armada in 1588, she said, "I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Secondly, and this is the point I really want to hammer home, Shakespeare leaves just enough to be guessed at, that he avoids being blatantly either insulting or complimentary to the Queen. There is lots of ambiguity in the examples I've given. So yes, the moon is in lots of scenes and oversees the action of the play, wields this power of true sight, but you could also argue that this could mean the moon is passive, doesn't do anything, it's at odds with the idea of an all-powerful active monarch. And yes, Theseus refers to the cold, fruitless, withering moon, but you could equally read in those lines something empowering about a woman's ability to choose the life of a nun, to choose not to bear children. As Clement argues, while Protestant England fostered a deep suspicion of celibacy in general and nunneries in particular, virginity remained an unmarried woman's most valuable or indeed only virtue, and choosing a life of celibacy came with its own appeal and power. Shakespeare may tease at references and allude to different anxieties and ideas surrounding Elizabeth, but not so much as to stake himself on one side or the other. I think this is best exemplified in Oberon's monologue, in which he describes how the magic flower used to manipulate Titania and the lovers came to be magic. And this is, by the way, often cited as the play's most clear and deliberate reference to Elizabeth. That very time I saw, flying between the cold moon and the earth, Cupid all armed. A certain aim he took at a fair vestal throned by the west, and loosed his love shaft smartly from his bow as it should pierce 100,000 hearts. But I might see young Cupid's fiery shaft quenched in the chaste beams of the watery moon, and the imperial votaress passed on in maiden meditation, fancy free. So what Oberon is saying here is that he saw Cupid aim a love arrow at a virgin and he missed because of the moonlight, and he hit the flower instead, making it magic. Now, my initial thoughts on this monologue and its relevance to the moon/Elizabeth is that it's a positive reference. Cupid's attempt to manipulate his target into falling in love with someone is thwarted by the chaste beams of the watery moon, chaste reminding us of Elizabeth's virginity. There is power here. The moon, the female entity, outmaneuvers the male. Equally, the fair vestal, i.e. a virgin priestess, that the moon protects, represents Elizabeth, drawing attention to the power of her beauty, purity, virginity, and divinity. If she represents both the moon and the vestal, she's protecting herself, she's self-sufficient. You could argue that Shakespeare is praising Elizabeth's integrity in maintaining her virginity and sovereignty. As C.L. Barber puts it, Shakespeare makes up a metamorphosis of the little western flower to motivate the play's follies and place Elizabeth superbly above them. But especially in relation to the wider context of the play, this representation of the Virgin and the moon could be read as a further insult. Again, the moon is cold and also watery, a word that evokes something opposite to steadfastness and strength expected of a monarch. You could make the case that the moon is getting in the way again, that she's stopping this young woman from falling in love. And of course, Cupid hits the flower still, which is about to be used to manipulate and subdue another queen, Titania. So here we have a passage that, depending on your reading, could be filled with praise, could be an insult. And herein lies Shakespeare's genius, his ambiguity, his ability to show up multiple perspectives and offer the potential of various different readings. As Chowdhury writes, Shakespeare weaves certain political motifs of his time into the complex design of the play, in a tangential, fictive reworking with no explicit commitment to any position. So Shakespeare layers metaphor about and allusion to Elizabeth throughout the play that can be read in a remarkable number of ways. And he employs a very similar strategy when writing about themes or ideas that might have Catholic connotations. To look at this in more depth, let's turn to the Faries. A Midsummer Night's Dream is filled with fairies who use magic to play tricks on humans, and of course Oberon and Puck play tricks on Titania too. When we watch or read the play today, we might see this as harmless magical fun based on our understanding of fairies, that they're mythological, fictional creatures. But this wasn't the overriding understanding of fairies in 1595. As Thomas writes, today's children are brought up to think of fairies as diminutive beings of a benevolent disposition, but the fairies of the Middle Ages were neither small nor particularly kindly. Fairies were frequently thought of as highly malevolent. The very word fairy was itself used to convey the idea of a malignant disease. So this is a very different way of thinking about fairies than perhaps what we're used to. Firstly, there was a genuine belief in the existence of fairies, and secondly, this belief often came with the caveat that fairies were evil beings. But as Thomas says, this was fairy belief in the Middle Ages, i.e. earlier than the Elizabethan age. So what then did people living in England in 1595 think about fairies? Well, you could definitely argue that belief in malevolent fairies persisted during Elizabeth's reign. There are cases of individuals who believed they were haunted by fairies and needed curing. Fairies were associated with evil spirits, and many people felt the need to adopt rituals in order to protect themselves from fairy mischief. These ideas would be taken up readily by King James I of England, who took the throne after Elizabeth's death in 1603. James, whose book Demonology, 1597, would go on to encourage the early modern witch panic, classified fairies as malevolent spirits. As Piotr Spira writes, to James, fairies are one of the many manifestations of the devil in the world, different only in appearance from the more demonic apparitions, but essentially not different in kind from those spirits that haunt particular places or afflict people with terror and madness. There was a clear connection then between devils, witchcraft and fairy magic. Thomas goes on to tell us, fairies belong to the same genre as the witches' familiars or the conjurers' demons. The name Oberon or Oberion was born by a demon who had been frequently conjured by 15th and 16th century wizards long before the title became associated with the king of the fairies. However, you could also argue that these views were rather extreme. It's important to bear in mind that while there was a cultural belief in the existence of fairies in the late 1500s, it wasn't necessarily the belief shared by the majority. As Thomas writes, the more sophisticated Elizabethans tended to speak as if fairy beliefs were a thing of the past, and this period saw the widespread dissemination of the concept of fairies as a dwarf race of mischievous but fundamentally friendly temperament. So you might be thinking, so that's how Shakespeare got away with writing about fairies. Even though some people believed in them and were convinced that they were malevolent, devilish spirits, enough people didn't believe in them, and if they did, thought they were friendly tricksters rather than frightening familiars. Shakespeare's fairies are charming and mischievous, not evil. And this is partly right, but there's a little more to it than that. More concerning, more threatening than the belief that fairies were little devils sent to cause trouble, was the connection between fairies and Catholicism. Fairies became part of the religious propaganda of the age, used by Protestant reformers to align Catholicism as closely as possible with nonsense, pagan ritual, and a lack of judgment. These reformers essentially devised a myth that fairy beliefs were an invention of the Catholic Middle Ages, and that fairies, like ghosts, were said to have been devised by popish priests to cover up their knaveries. Basically, the idea was that Catholics devised these fairy myths to keep people afraid and in the dark. Spira tells us that those who were inclined to question the reality of fairy encounters saw in them the products of a deluded imagination and associated the delusion with the superstitions and impostures of Catholicism. So if you're a theatre-goer in 1595 and you don't believe in being tricked by fairies, you may well believe in being tricked by Catholics. And being misled, tricked or manipulated, seeing things in riddles and falling for illusions and spells are all integral themes in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So how does Shakespeare write about fairies without ruffling feathers? Well, one answer is that he draws on so many different traditions and mixes them together to tell the story that it's not easy to decide what in the play is Catholic and what is folkloric, what's classical and what's contemporary. As Chowdhury writes, Shakespeare turns the fairy lore of his age, that was already a bit of a mishmash of traditions, into a sustained poetic creation, mingling classical, medieval and contemporary, remote and proximate, popular and elite. The play is made of diverse materials. He draws on high culture like Ovid, Plutarch and court poetry and drama, and he sets his play in Athens, the seat of classical learning, but equally he takes from low culture like folk tales and countryside festivities. He's appealing to both worlds and is layering a variety of sources and ideas in his work to appeal to a wider audience and to showcase a variety of perspectives. This layering of different traditions can also be used to explain, in part, Shakespeare's choice of title and its obvious associations with Midsummer, a celebration associated with Catholicism. If you go by the title alone, you'd probably assume the action of the play is set on Midsummer Night. But, as Jonathan Bate tells us, Shakespeare, who always had his cake and ate it too, magically merges his Midsummer Night with a hunt at dawn on May Day, as Theseus suggests when he finds the lovers in the woods at the end of the play. Shakespeare takes these two different celebrations and elements of their associated traditions and mixes them together, arguably diluting the connection between Midsummer and Catholicism by reading them outside their traditional context and apart from any specific sense of ritual. He blurs the lines and creates something that touches on these traditions but does not buy into them entirely. Furthermore, while the play revolves around magic, fairy trickery and the supernatural, you could make a strong case that Shakespeare is poking fun at people who legitimately believe in such things. As Barber notes, the humour of the play relates superstition, magic and passionate delusion as fancies images. The actual title emphasises a sceptical attitude by calling the comedy a dream. Any superstitious tendency to believe in the literal reality of the fairies is mocked. We watch a dream, but we're awake, thanks to pervasive humour about the tendency to take fantasy literally. Shakespeare draws on the tension between belief and illusion, gently mocking at the same time as he's celebrating the wealth of traditions that abound in the play. Shakespeare's use of comedy helps to offset any of the serious implications that you might read into the play about fairies, devils, or even Catholics. Equally, and wonderfully, you could argue the exact opposite, that Shakespeare's turning the mirror on people who are narrow-minded enough to reject belief in anything other than the corporeal, than what they can see before them. Take this brief yet significant exchange between Theseus and Hippolyta. "'Tis strange, my Theseus, that these lovers speak of." "More strange than true. I never may believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold, that is the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in fine frenzy rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Such tricks hath strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. Or in the night, imagining some fear, how easy is a bush supposed a bear? But all the story of the night told over, and all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesseth than fancy's images, and grows to something of great constancy, but howsoever strange and admirable." So, we've got a disagreement here between Hippolyta, who suggests there might be something to what the lovers have recounted, and Theseus, who dismisses their story. And we, the audience who are privy to what went on in the woods outside Athens, know that Hippolyta is right to be curious, and Theseus perhaps foolish for his blanket dismissal of these antique fables and fairy toys. He then goes on to compare the lunatic, lover, and madman as similar-minded in their propensity to fantasise beyond the realms of reality. Shakespeare describes how imagination gives tangible shapes to airy nothings, and for Theseus, this leads to beliefs grounded in falsities. In a play that constantly begs the questions, can we believe what we see and can we believe what we hear, Theseus's rejection of imagination is very narrow and blinkered. As much as Shakespeare might poke fun at people who believe in fairies and the fantastical, he also pokes fun at those who don't, those who are so certain about their version of reality that they will not entertain another's perspective. Now, a fascinating piece of context to bear in mind here is that the way Shakespeare's writing about imagination is actually very revolutionary. It might seem commonplace for us today to think of imagination as a means of creating something, a piece of writing, art, music, etc., seemingly from nothing, and how wonderful that is, how much we encourage it. But in the 16th century, the power of the imagination was a cause for concern. It could be overwhelming, and as Theseus suggests, maddening. It was dangerous, sinful and treacherous. The law actually defined imagining the death of the monarch as a treasonable offence, and medical books were filled with accounts of people experiencing delusions. You could maybe draw parallels between fearing the imagination and fearing witchcraft, the conjuring of something out of nothing. So there was a sense that imagination was very dark, dangerous and threatening in a way that we're not really familiar with today. What Shakespeare's saying here is radical, and we're familiar with this way of thinking about imagination because our view is shaped by the Romantics, like Keats, who in turn shaped their own views by reading Shakespeare. True to form, Shakespeare shows us multiple perspectives on the issue. Theseus is suspicious of imagination and doesn't believe the lovers, but at the same time he's delivering a beautiful treatise on the creative power of the imagination, and Hippolyta challenges his scepticism. Most importantly, the question of what actually happened to the lovers is left open-ended. All we have is the ability to reflect on what we've seen and heard, and instead of trying to figure out or pin down how real it all was, we can only admire its strangeness. Shakespeare does this throughout the play, skillfully integrates mystery and the illusory space of the dream to challenge his audience on their ability to perceive reality. And, you could argue, to absolve himself of any suggestion he might be taking a definite political or religious position on any given issue. I think this beautiful uncertainty is best exemplified at the very end of the play, in Puck's Epilogue. "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend. If you pardon, we will mend, and, as I am an honest Puck, If we have unearned luck now to scape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long. Else the puck a liar call. So good night unto you all. Give me your hands, if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends. Reflecting on the action of the play, Puck invites us to make up our own minds about what we've seen and what we deem illusory and how we feel about it. Puck also calls into question our ability to discern illusion, touching on ideas of faith, human agency, and the limits of knowledge. Furthermore, his language takes these ideas outside the realms of the story being told and highlights the duplicity and double dealings that make up the play. When he says, if we shadows have offended, for example, shadows refers to both the fairies and the actors. This rings of the doubling we've been treated to throughout, the illusion, the sense that there's more than one narrative at play, that something else is afoot, something in the shadows. It reminds me of Hermia's line just after she and the other lovers have woken up. She says, "Methinks I see these things with parted eye, when everything seems double." When he refers to the play's action as this weak and idle theme, I think of the Mechanicals and their weak and idle production of Pyramus and Thisbe. And again, this sense of layered narrative is reaffirmed as we are reminded of the play within the play. We're entreated to leave on a friendly note, not to reprehend the fairies and all the actors, and to trust an honest Puck, who of course has spent the entire play tricking people. So we're left to make up our own minds about what has happened, who or what we believe, and which version of events we trust. Do we call Puck a liar? Do we make amends? Do we feel compelled to give our hands in a gesture of friendship? And even this final gesture has a double meaning. To give your hands also means to applaud the play. Shakespeare's doubling here, as throughout the play, leaves us in the midst of illusion, reminding us of the layering of language, narrative, character and magic that persists on this midsummer night. And this takes us all the way back to the start of this video and to negative capability. To Shakespeare's genius for using doubt and mystery as creative principles that allow him to consider a range of ideas and perspectives, the creative, the political, the folkloric, the classical, the religious, without stating his allegiance to any one side. Shakespeare knew he could get in trouble for his writing, and it's his awareness, his negative capability, that spared him. As Shapiro writes, genius also meant knowing what you could get away with writing. So, there you have it. Shakespeare's negative capability, linguistic sensitivity, and acute social and political awareness means he can avoid censorship in a way that his contemporaries cannot. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Happy Midsummer, and please like, comment, and feel free to let me know your thoughts. And just so you know, I'll be uploading a new video on the 24th of each month, so please subscribe if you'd like to see more from me. Also, if you want to make this amazing cake, please join Anne-Louise Avery's Patreon for access to that recipe. And with that, I'll see you in the next video. It's pretty good.